This is the Voice of Russia, broadcasting from the heart of London. From Monday to Friday, we're live here on digital from 4 p.m. until 8. We're also online at ruvr.co.uk. Tune in for current affairs, news, arts and debate.
This is the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tim Walklate with part 1 of my sports review of the year. "2013 has had its fair share of highs and lows, which saw sensational doping revelations shake the world, record-breaking achievements, and some of the biggest sporting giants in history take a bow. In the first of this two-part special, joining me in the studio to look back on this year's biggest sporting events are Mihir Bose, an award-winning sports journalist and author, Natasha Henry, publisher and editor-in-chief of Women in Sport magazine, and Jonathan Wilson, a Guardian sports journalist and author. Thank you all for joining me. 2012 was always going to be a hard act to follow with its record-breaking London Olympic and Paralympic Games. So would sports fans find 2013 an anti-climax or even a damp squib? In fact, the past year has been one where sensationalism and scandal have been more in the headlines than success in sport. As January arrived, one of the biggest revelations in sporting history hit the headlines.
Did you ever take banned substances to enhance your cycling performance?
Yes.
Yes or no? Was one of those banned substances EPO?
Yes.
Did you ever blood dope or use blood transfusions to enhance your cycling performance?
Yes.
Did you ever use any other banned substances like testosterone, cortisone, or human growth hormone?
Yes.
Yes or no? In all 7 of your Tour de France victories, did you ever take banned substances or blood dope?
Yes.
So Lance Armstrong, the one-time darling of the cycling world, who returned to the sport following a successful battle with cancer and went on to win 7 Tour de France titles, admitted that his amazing record was in part due to using banned drugs. The disgraced cyclist, who was stripped of his 7 Tour wins, finally confessed on American TV to host Oprah Winfrey. He's since been subject to numerous lawsuits after years of denying his doping activities. Mihir Bose, have these revelations sent cycling back into the dark ages?
They haven't sent cycling back into the dark ages. They've raised all sorts of questions about how the sport is run, how the sport is administered, because these allegations have been around for a very long time. And as a journalist, I must feel proud in my profession that David Walsh of the Sunday Times relentlessly pursued it, and a couple of other journalists. But the questions it raises is, why did the organisations, the Cycling Federation, do nothing about it? And the other question it raises is, how long are we going to have this omerta, silence among the sportsmen? And this just isn't about cycling, about other sports where misdeeds happen, and because they have a bond, they don't want to sort of rat on their people who've committed offences. And I think it exposes both of this, and it's taken a long time. And of course it's taken a long time because the Americans didn't get their world anti-doping organisations right.
Well, it's been a bit of a running theme of 2013, doping. Would you agree with that, Natasha?
Yeah, completely. I think Lance Armstrong is a very, very particular case because of how famous he was, because of the charity work that he did and the money that he raised for cancer treatment. So I think a lot of people felt really hurt. Even those who weren't, say, big cycling fans had bought into this concept and this mantra of his life. I think it definitely raises questions about the amount of money in sport and how that money enables people to possibly not follow the rules.
Would you say that cycling is now clean? I mean, lots of questions have been raised about that. I know that's quite a hefty question to throw on you immediately into this.
I don't think you can say any sport is completely clean, because there is always going to be bad eggs in any walk of life. But I think revelations like this hopefully help the boards work together, come up with better plans to ensure that it is cleaner than it may have been in the past.
Jonathan, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, has this taken cycling back to a dark age? I think it's actually a very positive thing for cycling that
anybody who'd read David Walsh's work, and particularly his book from Lloyd to Landis, if you read that and weren't deeply troubled, then there's something wrong. It was pretty obvious that doping was going on a massive scale. I think most cyclists knew exactly what was going on, and if you know that the main man in your profession, the bloke who's winning everything, is cheating, why would you not cheat?
But there is something in sport which Dick Pound, of course, who was a man, let's give him credit. He always raised questions.
The former
head of WADA,
WADA,
a very prominent figure in the Olympic movement. But what he's always said is that sport is one of those organisations, trade, call it what you will, profession, where if you're caught, you don't ever say, fair cop, I did it. Even Ben Johnson initially said it was a spiked drink, of course, and it's not like most of us, if we're caught with something, at the end of the day the trial takes place or whatever, that's you got to admit, we all, I believe in the redemptive power of sport and how it can reach out beyond many other things, but there is this element among sportsmen that, as if they do something wrong, it doesn't count as wrong, and hopefully Armstrong will be the first step in when sportsmen say they're also like other human beings, if they commit crimes, then that is a crime.
Well, I think up to a point it has to be self-policing as well. You have to have, in the same way that golfers have a very clear code that they don't cheat, that code has to be there in all sports.
Yeah, well, but what is happening, Jonathan, now, if you see in cricket and so on, which is probably the ultimate, gentleman's game, where if you know you're out,
is it me here? Is it? We'll talk about that later.
One would like to think it still is, but if you know you're out, you still don't walk. I mean, let's not confuse what Armstrong did with what happens in cricket. They're on two different scales. But hopefully this will break that sort of, almost trade union-like silence that sport has. We can't, look at how Liverpool handled Luis Suarez.
There is a big thing in sport that I always notice is that they feel as if they live by a different moral code to the rest of us.
Well, we will address this several times throughout the next half hour, an hour. In February, the salacious headlines kept on coming after European police, or Europol, revealed that hundreds of football matches across the continent were suspected of being involved in match fixing.
This is match fixing activity on a scale that we've not seen before, involving hundreds of criminals and corrupted officials and players, affecting hundreds of professional matches and generating very large amounts of illicit profits. It is also the work of a sophisticated international organised crime syndicate based in Asia and working with criminal facilitators around Europe.
That was Rob Wainwright, the director of Europol, announcing that they'd found evidence of match fixing at 380 games across Europe, which included international qualifiers and Champions League games. There have since been police crackdowns across Europe, including in Britain, where a number of cases have arisen. Again, it's a theme that's run on throughout the year. Jonathan Wilson, is this surprising? Was that news surprising to you?
No, it wasn't, to be honest. I think there's anybody who works in football, you see games that feel wrong. They're very rarely games at the very highest level. I mean, there's one World Cup game from 2006 I think most people have grave suspicions about, which obviously we can't actually say what the game is. But I think basically in the Premier League we're still relatively safe in that players are paid so much that the amount you'd have to give them to make it worth jeopardising that is more than you could realistically hope to make from gambling. But at lower levels, I think we've known it's been right for ages. I mean, I think it should be said as well that the recent revelations about spot fixing and players claiming that they could persuade others to get bookings or be sent off, that strikes me as being a slightly academic argument, in that you cannot put on more than £250 on a British high street for a player to be booked. And as far as I'm aware, the fact that it is so manipulable means that the sort of semi-legal and illegal bookmakers would not accept a bet on it. So that, I think, is an academic thing, but it does suggest the corruptibility. And obviously, even if games are being fixed in the Conference South or at a very low level, once you start to erode the faith in the sport, that's a very serious thing. And I'll give you an example of that. I was at a dinner recently with a former New Zealand Test cricketer, and it was the same day that Liverpool had drawn 3-3 with Everton. And he was saying that to him, having experienced match fixing in cricket, and saying that some of the games he played in he had deep suspicions about, and one of the games he regarded as his greatest game, he now thinks maybe it wasn't great, maybe the other team were chucking it. And he said that Liverpool-Everton game, he saw the drama the last few minutes and thought, this doesn't feel right, I think there's something wrong here. Now that is a tragic thing if fans start to watch football and the unpredictable nature of it, something dramatic happens, and you, rather than thinking, that's amazing, you think, that's fixed.
It could potentially damage the integrity of the game.
Absolutely, yeah. And you see it, I mean, countries like Romania where it's been rife, I've watched games in Romania and a goal goes in the last minute and the crowd go, it's cash. And it's just a last minute goal. And any unpredictable result, a team at the bottom of the table holding a team at the top of the table, it's fixed. And the beauty of sport is it's not predictable. And once you corrode that, then you've got very little left.
In Britain, it has been something that was more prevalent in the lower leagues. It's always going to be more corruptible when there's less money involved in those sorts of leagues. How do you police that, Mihir Bose?
Well, the problem is it's not a British problem. I've just come back from Qatar. Now, I'm not talking about match fixing there. There, endlessly on television, you're shown British matches, English football, Premier League matches, and that goes all around the world. What we are confronted with is an international scourge of an amazing dimension, which is much of this illegal betting is taking place outside Britain. Britain, on the whole, I believe, polices its bets. It's now legalised, has been legalised for a long time, unlike 1960 when much of it was illegal and where there was then corruption. But in the rest of the world, a normal bet, I could go out, I couldn't bet more than £250 on somebody being sent off, but I could go out without, of course, telling my wife and place a bet, which I often do. But that is not illegal. It may not be wise and it may not help my marriage, but it's not illegal. Whereas that could not happen on the Indian subcontinent. It could not happen in Singapore. It could happen in large parts of the world where the betting money is coming in, where people bet, as Jonathan was saying, on just margins, who will win by 1 goal or 2 goals or things like that. And therefore there is no system. I know sports ministers have met and talked about it, but unless they have an international, if you like, similar to WADA, an agency which says this is the uniform way of policing it, unless sports organizations around the world are willing to self-police rather than just talk about it and hire ex-policemen to come in and, give a veneer of respectability to what they're doing, I don't think we're going to stop it. Because, we're going to have people coming in. And what is very worrying now is that these match fixers have worked out that the easiest way to do it is to nobble the referee much more than the player. After all, you give a free kick in an advantageous position or a penalty, it's a completely, you can pass it off as a legitimate error that's happened. And that is the worrying thing, and I see no sign, and I've gone around various conferences and I see no sign that they're actually tackling it. What we are faced with is what America faced with in the 1920s on prohibition. You make something natural illegal, and therefore you push it into criminal gangs, and there's no way of controlling it.
The recent revelations have reminded us that we're not so perfect in England. It does go on everywhere. It's not just an Indian problem or wherever. Everyone's involved, and it is a collective sports group needs to come together and work together to ensure that players aren't being bribed or feeling that they need to be put in that situation. I also think as well it's a gambling culture, and the reason we have players lower league is they become regular gamblers, they're losing money, and someone says here's 20 grand, that gives them the opportunity to clear their debt. So it's always been a gambling culture in football. You have so many players coming out now talking about how much money they've lost. Keith Gillespie the other day.
I think one other point one should emphasise is that when they do spot fixing, players can often think they're not actually throwing a match. I saw this with Hansi Cronje nearly 15 years ago now when he was caught. And he went into what was essentially a witness, the King inquiry in Cape Town. It was astonishing to hear him say, yes, he had taken money from illegal Indian bookmakers, but he was still proud of what he had done as South African captain. He had never thrown a match. And the Pakistani cricketers who were jailed, they have the satisfaction, we're just doing, a minor thing, Got a yellow card, got a red card, what difference does it make?
So again, it seems to come back once again to self-policing to some extent. Yeah. Moving on to April. Even more scandal. The horse racing world was stunned by revelations that 22 horses from the Godolphin stables had been treated with banned steroids. The Godolphin empire belongs to Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum of Dubai, which has won over 2,000 races worldwide since its inception in 1982. This scandal has been described as the biggest in racing history. Mihir, would you agree with that?
I would agree, but again, this scandal has opened up what some people in racing were saying was taking place. And historically in the past, this is going back a long way, it did take place. But I don't think the racing world answered all the questions, because the way it was presented was it was one, if you like, rogue trainer who somehow got hold of certain drugs and gave it to the horses. We didn't get a full explanation as to how this could happen in one of the biggest stables in the world, a man whose money, let's face it, finances much of British racing. Without his money, flat racing certainly in Britain would be in grave trouble. We didn't get enough answers, and I don't think he was asked, or nobody dared ask him questions as to how this happened. It's a bit like if something happens in your organisation, it may be a lowly employee down the track, but what sort of controls do you have in your own organisation that lowly employee can do that? And I think there are several unanswered questions here.
So do you think it's been just sort of brushed under the carpet a little bit?
I can't prove that, but that's a suspicion of a lot of people. The way, how quickly it was done, when these things happen, and they're quite major things when they happen, and when they suddenly say, all right, we found all the answers, you think, is there a bit of a Watergate here? And I've spoken to various people, vets and all, connected with horse racing, and they say that it takes place a lot, not just with what happened with Godolphin, it takes place a lot, and it's not uncommon.
Jonathan Wilson.
I think on a general point, I think it's very unlikely that only one trainer is involved. I think sports develop a culture of this, because as soon as one person starts doing it, there's streets ahead, so others have to also get involved to catch up. And I think also sports tend to they all go through the same process, the same with football and match fixing, same with cycling and doping. The initial reaction of the authorities is almost invariably deny it. We've got to protect the image of the sport. And then as the story builds and builds and builds, and the evidence builds and builds and builds, you eventually have to go, right, okay, it's an absolute mess, we've got to clean this out. And cycling, I think, is going through that, or has gone through that. Football is still locked in that process of what stage are we at, and it seems to me, as a complete outsider, I should say, that racing really is still in the sort of it's not really going on, it's not a big problem stage, and they probably have to face up with the fact that it is quite significant.
It's a bit like phone hacking, Yeah. We all know phone hacking was done by just one reporter. We all know that, don't we? I mean,
rogue reporter.
Yeah, but the fact is, where did that employee get the money? How did he get the? There must be some chains of command somewhere along the way.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London Sports Review of 2013 with me, Tim Walklate. Joining me in the studio to look back on this year's biggest sporting events are Mihir Bose, an award-winning sports journalist and author, Natasha Henry, publisher and editor-in-chief of Women in Sport magazine, and Jonathan Wilson, a Guardian sports journalist and author. As May arrived, football was back in the headlines. First of all, with Sir Alex Ferguson making the shock announcement that he was to stand down as manager of Manchester United after 26 years at the helm. During his career at Old Trafford, he guided his team to 13 Premier League titles, 2 European Champions League trophies, 5 FA Cups, 4 League Cups, and 1 World Club Cup. He produced generations of title-winning teams, and for some fans, it was impossible to separate Man United from Sir Alex. United obviously not doing as well now. Natasha Henry, how devastating a blow was this?
Oh, I think it's huge. I think some people really underestimated how much Man U was Sir Alex Ferguson. I think you take him away and you take away a lot of the soul, a lot of the passion. You have managers who are just entwined with their clubs. Arsene Wenger at Arsenal is another example. And you look at the team now, and David Moyes will come good, I think. He needs time. But he has the same team. Virtually the same team. But I'm not a footballer, but I imagine when you grow up and you want to be a footballer, you grow up wanting to play for Sir Alex Ferguson. You don't necessarily grow up wanting to play for David Moyes. So when you have that man standing in front of you in the changing room talking to you, the passion he invokes in you, the feeling, the kind of belief that you can go out there and win trophies, which was, let's be honest, a pretty poor Man United side. Moyes doesn't have that gravitas yet, that kind of aura that Ferguson has.
Jonathan Wilson, will they ever be able to recover and become the team that they were under Sir Alex Ferguson?
I think the structures in football, as they are now, they self-perpetuate the elite. So I'd be surprised if they dropped away as, say, Liverpool did in the 90s. But they clearly have short-term issues to address, and I think there are longer-term issues to address in the sense that there is less investment in personnel since the Glazers took over than there was before. That signings of the like of Juan Sebastian Veron or Rio Ferdinand or Ruud van Nistelrooy, those absolute top players in their positions in the world, where they had to fight off other major clubs, they're not even competing for that type of player anymore.
But it wasn't about that under Fergie, was it? It was about...
Well, it was partly about that, and I think their lack of European success over the last 5 years, you can argue, was in part down to that failure to challenge. I think what Ferguson did was he took at times a sort of a B plus or an A minus squad and made them able to compete with an A plus squad. There were regular occasions in the last decade when at the start of the season you look at the squads and you think, well, United are probably only the 4th or 5th best squad, and then you think, okay, inflate that because of the Ferguson factor, they're going to be one of the two teams challenging for the title. That's not there anymore, and I think that has two effects. A, it sort of removes United players their sense of their own invincibility, and it also means that other teams attack them more. And I think if you look at the comparison between United's Premier League form and the European form this season, you see the Premier League teams aren't scared. They go to Old Trafford and they attack. Teams from abroad haven't quite gotten on to the fact that the Euro's not there anymore. So Bayer Leverkusen and Real Sociedad were very, very negative in both games against United, and United were able to prosper. But if you go at United now, they have a soft centre.
Very quick point from me here.
Well, United's nightmare has always been what happens after Ferguson, because, they all know what happened after Matt Busby. United actually got relegated. I mean, I don't think United will get relegated, so that's always been the transition. But I think Ferguson, a team that last year won by 11 points was certainly not one of his best teams, and many people would say would probably not even, as good as any team he's produced. And Moyes has a problem, but the other issue here is what we are seeing now. I mean, nobody will get as much time as Ferguson got. I remember in 1989, fans invaded Martin Edwards' director's box trying to get rid of Ferguson. Nobody will get that sort of time, as nobody will get the time that Arsene Wenger got. We are moving into a different era. We are moving into more of a continental system. Look at the amount of managers Real Madrid has had, 23 since the Premier League started. And yet Real Madrid's success still goes on. So we are moving into that era, and whether Moyes can cope with that and also the expectations of the fans, one will have to wait and see.
So 4 days after Sir Alex Ferguson retired, Wigan Athletic claimed their first major trophy by beating Manchester City in a classic David versus Goliath FA Cup final at Wembley. Ben Watson's last-minute goal separated the two sides, but weeks later the Lancashire team were relegated from the Premier League. I'll just ask you, Jonathan Wilson, on this. Did you enjoy the match?
I mean, it was brilliant in the sense that this is what the FA Cup's about. It's about the little team who's got no chance of winning the Premier League, winning a trophy, beating the team that spent the best part of £1 billion on its squad. So that was brilliant. But also you had the subplots of the managers, that it was 3 days later or 4 days later that the Wigan were relegated, and we already knew Martinez was almost certain to leave. But you also had Mancini teetering on the brink, and we pretty much now know it was during that game a decision was made to get rid of him, and I think he was sacked the following Tuesday. So that game, it was great in and of itself, but it had these wider ramifications, and it still shows that football, for all the power that money has today, you still do get the unpredictable, you still do get the romance.
Mihibos, very quickly.
But it also shows how the FA Cup has declined. Winning the FA Cup 30 years ago was almost as good as winning the league, and managers will now tell you they would rather finish in the top 4 than win the FA Cup,
but
which is sad.
Didn't it rekindle some magic?
No, I don't think so. You talk to any manager in the top 4, they will always want to be in the Champions League. The FA Cup, for various reasons, and partly because of the way the FA have mismanaged things, is no longer a big competition in the sense it was when I was a child. When winning the FA Cup, if you didn't win the league, it was just good enough.
It may not have rekindled things for managers or players, but definitely for fans, I think, which a lot of fans are becoming disillusioned with the FA Cup. Seeing Wigan win against City, who a lot of neutrals maybe aren't a fan of, I definitely think it brought back that whole little team, big team, and the shock of football. What can happen in the last minute? You never know.
Well, as the summer sun finally arrived in July, so did a great deal of British sporting success. The British and Irish Lions thrashed Australia in Sydney to win the 3-match series down under. It was the first time a Lions team had won a tour since 1997. A day later, Andy Murray beat Novak Djokovic in straight sets to become the first British men's champion at Wimbledon for 77 years. And the Scot described his relief after the match.
To just have finally done it, I think it'll be nice that as a nation we don't have to look at Wimbledon as being sort of a negative. It can be viewed as a positive, and I just hope it's not another 70 odd years again. You know, I know what it's like losing in a Wimbledon final, and I know what it's like winning one, and it's a lot better winning.
The dulcet tones of Andy Murray there. And like London buses, Chris Froome became the second British rider to win the Tour de France a year after Bradley Wiggins claimed victory in 2012. This sort of 3 weeks in July, was that sort of the kind of the purple patch for British sport this year?
Yeah,
Natasha?
I think following the Olympics, everyone was a lot more hyped, a lot more interested in sports that maybe they'd not noticed before. So I think the fact that this year it continued, we had a lot of success in athletics, tennis, etc. I think it's kind of creating a buzz, keeping the interest going, and I hate to use the word, but legacy of the Olympics, definitely in terms of supporters and people watching sports these days.
Mihir Bose, on Andy Murray, do you think that he's going to win more Grand Slams?
I think he's going to win more Grand Slams. I think, breaking that enormous barrier, I think that was huge. I think it started when he actually beat Federer in the Olympics, at the same venue the previous year. And I think he's going to win more. And, I think Chris Froome's was if you like, an even greater cultural triumph following on from, winning in the Tour de France, not a race that the British have done well. But I think Andy Murray, he showed. The only question is what role he plays in the Scottish referendum and whether he's considered Scottish or English. That is an open debate.
We'll leave that for next September, I think. Jonathan Wilson, Chris Froome didn't get the same level of recognition as Bradley Wiggins. Is that just the case of somebody following in somebody's footsteps?
Yeah, I think for Wiggins to win it, to be the first Brit to win the Tour de France was always going to be an enormous event. For Froome to win, I mean, in many ways, won it more impressively, I think. And he obviously had a huge role to play in Wiggins' triumph. But you wonder as well whether Froome winning, whether he benefited psychologically from the fact that Wiggins had sort of broken this barrier of British people not winning the Tour de France. And I suspect we'll see the same with Andy Murray, that was always in the background. No British man's won at Wimbledon for 77 years, 78, 79, 80. That's not there anymore. Nobody's going to talk about that in 2 or 3 years' time, and maybe that'll just lift some of that pressure.
Mihir Bose?
Yeah, I think winning something for the first time. You talk to players and you ask them, you've never won at that ground for 10 years. They say, we don't think about it. But actually, they do think about it. For instance, England hasn't won in English cricket, hasn't won a limited overs final, which, they had the greatest chance against India in the summer. And they didn't do it, and they collapsed towards the end. And I lost money as well, if I may confess. But, and you could see, whatever the players say, it's not just skill or ability. There is a sort of mental barrier there to overcome. You look at it and you think, I haven't been here before, can I do it? And that is a huge thing to overcome.
That ends the first part of the Voice of Russia in London's Sport Review of 2013. I'd like to thank all my guests, Mihir Bose, an award-winning sports journalist and author, Natasha Henry, publisher and editor-in-chief of Women in Sport magazine, and Jonathan Wilson, a Guardian sports journalist and author. Tune in again to hear the second part of this review. But for now, from me, Tim Walklate, goodbye.